I just want to start out thinking a little bit about like some of the key concepts you begin with in your most recent book, Resilient Leadership, about losing heart and losing nerve. I know those are concepts you borrowed from elsewhere, and you've really explained them beautifully. This has been a really hard year for church leaders. On top of everything that's happened with COVID, we've had everything politicized as well. And when you talk to pastors across the country, how many of them are struggling with cynicism and despair?
Yeah. So the notions of failures of nerve and failures of heart are really about our responses to sabotage, like a response to the resistance of our people. And with folks who are experiencing the resistance of their people are really despairing. I mean, it's particularly hard right now.
Every week I'm hearing about fellow ministers who are leaving ministry for good. If you had somebody on the phone who was asking, why should I stay in ministry? I mean, I know it's an individualized question, but what are some things you might ask? What would you want to explore? I'm getting, I don't know if it's internet. I don't know what the internet issue is. Can you hear me okay? Oh, no.
I lost you there for a minute. I didn't know if that was you or me.
I don't know who it is. So can I go back to that question again?
Yeah, please.
So every week I hear about fellow ministers who are quitting ministry and for good, seems like. If you had somebody on the other end of the phone who was exploring, thinking about that, what might you ask? What would you want to explore with them and before you gave some advice?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would ask is I would ask two things. One is I would ask, you're disappointed at the moment. What were you hoping it was going to be? Like, in one sense, let's be really clear about our expectations. I mean, I think many of us had really good-hearted expectations, but they were expectations that have been dashed. You know, we thought that our ministries were going to be about loving God and loving people we love, and teaching the people we love to love the God we love, and it was all going to be good. And we didn't realize we were going to be doing it in such a disruptive time that we are literally going to have call people to a kind of transformation that we might not have seen ourselves ready to do, like disappointing people, dealing with their resistance, dealing with the fact that for many people there's a declining involvement in the church. It's a hard season. So I would want them.
Yeah, can I just dig deeper on that for a second?
Yeah.
So like in the midst of all this, there's been the George Floyd and all the other issues dealing with race. And so some ministers, good friends of mine, have felt the need to stand up during the season.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And yet be totally attacked
Yep.
For their stands and just want to give up. That's the sabotage you're talking about. But I mean, how do you come back to the mission?
Yeah. So I think more than anything, I want people to have a sense of what they started with, what the expectation they started with. And then I want them to actually come to grips with, we are in this season, we're going to have to go forward. Is this what you want to be doing? It's like one example that I've given to I had a younger pastor come up to me and say, you talk a lot about uncharted territory and leading off the map and being in exile in the wilderness. So how much of the ministry do you need to do that? The first 2, 3, 4 years? I said, I have a hunch that's going to be at least 2 generations. Like I have a hunch that I'm part of a generation that's going to die in the wilderness, and you might be too. Our job is to be faithful to the gospel so that a day might come when we will see the new day. I mean, think about Jeremiah 29:11, right? The famous verse. I know the plans I have for you. Well, you look at that in context. It's 70 years, 70 years from now, your grandchildren might have the opportunity to move out of exile into a whole new day if you're faithful, if you will bless the place that I have sent you. So could we believe that our job is to be faithful for a couple of generations so that there might be a whole new day of ministry and fruit and vitality? It might be that. And I think that's what we have to be willing to see ourselves signing up for, that we haven't expected to be.
Very sobering talk.
Yeah, it is. Actually, it's a sobering time, isn't it? I mean, it's an important time. It's a critical time. I've never thought there was a need for better, stronger, deeper, more deeply formed leadership in all of the years I've been in ministry than right this moment. And so I don't think it does us any good to pretend otherwise. And it's sobering, but to me, it's not depressive. It's a challenge that we're called to take on.
So I'm sure we'll come back to that, but the failure of heart and failure of nerve, I mean, it's kind of like this porous boundaries or boundaries that are not porous enough, right? This taking on too much feeling for others and giving up. So just to make peace. And so not pushing forward to the mission, as opposed to the failure of heart, which is kind of becoming too hardened to the relationships you need to drive the mission. That seems like kind of a very narrow window to kind of thread a needle through, to stay both engaged, but also to stay focused on the mission and not give it up. I don't know. That seems like a pretty tall task.
Well, that's why, I mean, the book Tempered Resilience is really about the formation needed. I don't at all believe that we can just do this out of our flesh, that we actually need to be formed to be more like Christ. And, if the failure of nerve is our tendency to stop the movement forward because we identify with our people and who want the status quo, who want the familiar, they want to go back. It's Moses confronting a group of people who want to go back to slavery because they have hit the harsh hardship of the wilderness. That failure of nerve needs for us to rely upon God and needs to continue to go forward in the mission. The failure of heart is what happens when we start getting so angry at our people for their very human anxiety, right? I always say sabotage is not the bad things evil people do. It's the human things anxious people do. The people who want the familiar, right? I just always say, remember, there's a connection between the word familiar and family, right? So when you're in unfamiliar territory, it's like you've been abandoned, like you've lost your family. It's not just that you're discouraged, it's that you feel really anxious. And when people want to go back, what they're really trying to do is go back to what's familiar, to go back to what's home. And you're actually calling them beyond the safety of the familiar into the unknown, where it's going to take faith and it's going to require us to be transformed. And so it's a transformational moment that we've got to also allow ourselves to be transformed to do.
So speaking about the familiar, let me hone in on the tribe, denomination, non-denomination, churches of Christ that most of us probably are listening in or part of this, that tribe. Churches of Christ, this has a special kind of past to leave behind, so to speak. And let me think for a second about church polity, because in our particular way of doing things, the senior minister may have the authority of the pulpit, and most of the church members today who know all kinds of churches around, they may expect that the senior minister is the guy driving the vision. But at least in our organizational system, most churches have the elders above the minister, and sometimes even the minister is not even included on decision making with the elders, which is a really strange situation probably for somebody from outside of our tribe. But I know there's always things that other churches have to deal with. But for example, the lead minister at one of our largest West Coast churches, he and his elders together decided a year ago how they were going to address the COVID situation. They were going to follow the state county protocols. They were going to do everything they could to follow the guidelines. And then there's been all kinds of folks during the year who sabotage, who've been angry, of course, and they take out most of their anger out at the preacher.
Yeah.
And then just a couple of weeks ago, the elders met secretly without the preacher to decide to open the doors and start again in-person worship. So they got to be the heroes. We're opening the church. And they didn't even, the decision wasn't a bad one, but is that they disrespected him in the process.
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if that's familiar from other church backgrounds, but certainly is a particular issue we deal with. What would you say to that kind of situation, to a minister who's trying to survive in that kind of situation?
Well, I think one of the things I'd say to the minister is that part of your job is actually to be aware that you don't always have power. You're not always leading from a place of power. Adaptive leadership is about being willing to lead even when you don't have authority. So just always be reminded that you're always authorized for the status quo. If all you want to do is minister within your power and your authority, then things will stay the same, because whatever is in power and whatever is dominant is going to want to keep things the status quo. When you're trying to actually bring change, you actually have got to be able to lead without power and authority, which means you're now having to lead from the position of formation, of leading, of giving the work back to the people, of developing the adaptive capacity of your board. And so in this case, one of the things I would do is I would think this is a great moment for the pastor to sit down with the board and say, all right, the decision's been made. Let's look at what the decision did. What did it do to my credibility? What did it do to our credibility? What did it do to our rationale? Is it increasing trust? You're all popular at the moment, and that's great, but what is it going to do long term when we've got to take people through hard things? Like, this is where we have to lead with questions that talk more about the healthy organizational culture. One good example of this is really interesting. Stanley McChrystal, who was a general in the military, wrote a book called Team of Teams. And he says that the leadership of the future, even in the military, is less about command and control and more about the leader as what he calls the gardener of a culture, like the cultivator of a healthy culture. So I would say, whether you have power or authority or not, your responsibility as a leader is to be trying to create the healthiest organizational culture so that the most fruit can grow. And that's going to be a challenge for most of us who just assume that, leadership requires authority and power. And more, when you're trying to bring change, it actually is not based on that.
That is a profound shift to think about leadership, even without power.
Yeah. It's really having to lead the process of formation. So it's in my book, I define leadership as energizing your own people to their own transformation so that we might face our mission. And so might be able to carry out our mission, right? So if the changes and the challenges we're facing in terms of carrying the mission of our church forward require us to be transformed, it starts with my own transformation as a leader, our leadership team, and particularly our board and our leaders. We have to face where we need to be transformed in order to carry out the mission God's given us.
So one of the legendary stories of our fellowship, our churches, is of a well-known preacher in the 1980s who was at a major influential church in Texas. And he'd been there some short period of time, but he sat through an elders meeting where for 30 minutes, they talked about something inane like the painting of stripes in the parking lot. And they got to the end of that 30 minutes and he just simply said to them in the middle of this meeting, he said, I probably don't have the quote right, but gentlemen, you've just wasted 30 minutes of the Lord's time that we'll never get back. Can we now get back to the business of leading the church? And
Yeah.
I heard from an associate minister there at the time that he just assumed they were all going to be fired on the spot because you didn't talk to elders that way.
Right.
But you're talking about, I don't know if you're talking about confronting as much as you are just talking about you have to step in and nurture and build relationships, right, with the people you're working with.
Yeah, and hold up a mirror and ask questions. I mean, a lot more of our leadership these days is asking people to do some reflection on what we're doing and why we're doing it. So the question I would want, if I was the senior pastor who said, we've come up to an agreement that we're not going to, open our doors yet. We're going to follow these protocols. You all decided to do it. What was going on? like what was it that made you decide to go against our agreement? And what made you decide to do it without my being in the room? And what, it's what Ronald Heifetz calls paying attention to the music that is underneath the words. Because it's the music that's got people dancing. The lyrics are all pretty straightforward. And so what you're paying attention to is that anxious system that is driving people to make decisions that actually, in this case, contradict what they'd all agreed to do. And that's just never going to be healthy. Health is really about clarity and congruence in a way that people understand that you are making decisions for the good of the mission. And you're willing even to do so in light of disappointment of people.
So continuing with that and going back to what you were talking about earlier about letting go of some things. I don't know if that's quite what you said, but you talk about in your most recent book, and you mentioned your colleague, Mark Branson there at Fuller,
Mm-hmm.
who's been here in Fresno to our church. He talks about the importance of unlearning, of unknowing, of that wilderness experience that you described so beautifully in your Canoeing the Mountains, that we have to let go of some things before we can experience renewal. This seems like a really hard thing to convince people that we need to let go of some things in order to move forward, to move into uncharted territory. How do you describe that to a church?
Yeah. Well, you start by acknowledging how hard it is. And so one of the precepts of systems thinking is today's problems are built on yesterday's successes. The hardest decisions you're making today is because it was really successful yesterday. So, if you're a really great canoeer, you're going to want to just paddle harder. If you've run out of water, paddling harder means you'll get exhausted sooner. And so the changing terrain, the changing environment doesn't mean you change your core mission. Are still trying to go forward and discover a whole new world. We're still trying to make it to the Pacific Ocean. But we've got to be willing to say, look, there isn't a water route. We're not going to kind of keep paddling. We can't keep trying harder. Ed Friedman calls this having imaginative gridlock, where people just can't get out of their way. Well, what do they need to do? He says they need to have a spirit of adventure, which requires learning and results in loss. Every adventure, there's loss. There's things you're having to choose to let go of. And I would say the biggest question most churches have to deal with now is asking ourselves the question, what should absolutely never change? What is essential about us? What is it that we will never let go of? And let's get that down to something that is really clearly essential. And then let's be prepared to ask hard questions about letting go of everything else. And these are painful and these are difficult, but they're necessary, because right now we are exhausting ourselves trying to carry everything from our past into a future where it doesn't all work.
And what about when the way you operate has been so tied up into who you are that to let go of some of those things makes you question who you are?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'll give one example from my own life. I'm a Presbyterian, so I happen to believe deeply that leadership is a shared experience. So we are elder ruled, right? We don't have a bishop. We have committees and groups of people. I wouldn't give that up. That part I really believe in. It's a conviction. But there are so many other parts that we say are being Presbyterian that really are about cultural things. They're not about our structure, our convictions, our theology. They're about stuff like we've been committed to a highly educated clergy. I happen to be a highly educated clergy. Well, that's not necessarily a core conviction. That's a way that we've been shaped by our culture. So what about when the church needs to go into other places in the world where there are people without master's degrees or doctorate degrees, but who can be wise, learned clergy in a different context, in a different place that we need? What's it going to require for us to rethink what it takes to do spiritual leadership? It might not be a lot of initials after your name. And it might not be, you might not have the privilege of being able to afford multiple years of graduate education in order to lead a congregation. So we start to rethink some of these things that are important to us, but may not be core to us.
So could part of the problem, because I hear what you're saying, and I'm totally in agreement with this need to change in these ways, but sometimes we at least in our heritage have invested a lot of capital in changing maybe our worship style,
right?
Or trying to become more gender inclusive or more diverse. And those aren't things that we want to negotiate, but at the same time, we've invested so much capital and we've lost things in that journey to those things. And we wonder at the end of that, why aren't we now suddenly filling up the church?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you start talking about the fact that the world is changing and we feel a prophetic desire to be connected in other things, say like gender inclusivity or something, that needs to be understood as being such a core conviction that we're willing to lose other things. It can't be an add-on. I always say that, especially if you expect large churches often run into the problem where they are like a kid who is really, really good at doing addition, but never learned how to do subtraction. Like we have one tool and we just keep adding more to it. And I say a lot of larger churches, we're good at addition and we're good at division. We're not good at subtraction and we're not good at multiplication. And so we struggle with needing to develop some other capacities. And some of those capacities are stuff like asking ourselves questions about why if we made decisions about worship styles and what's that cost us, as opposed to decisions about convictions about the way we treat people, what justice means, what fairness means. We have to be able to separate out these conversations have those hard conversations, be clear about them, and then stay the course when you make a decision. What drives people crazy is when we're jerking from one thing to the other to the other. And one person said ambiguity is the enemy of change, and you have to have clarity that's not stubborn or hubristic, but clear, calm clarity.
Could that be where the importance of lament comes in? You talk about that. You quote Ra in talking about lament. And you talk at the beginning, you already jumped ahead about how long this period of loss and lament might need to be. You're saying it may be a generation or two that we have to go through this loss and lament.
I would love it not to be, but what lament teaches us to do is to take seriously the pain of the world and the pain of our neighbor. So one of the stories I tell in the book is going to meet with a group of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and telling them about a new venture I was starting for the seminary. And really, they asked me to give them the pitch. And when I told them what we were doing, they all looked at me and said, "You just told us why this would be good for your institution. Who are you actually trying to help?" And I remember at the time going, "Oh, actually, we want to help church leaders." He said, "But you realize you're talking about this entirely about what's good for the institution. Nobody cares if your institution survives. They only care if your institution cares about them." And I think this is the way our churches have to think. Nobody cares if our church on the corner survives. What they care is if our church cares about them. And one of the ways we demonstrate we care about them is by grieving with them, being aware of the pain, the brokenness, the injustice, the fears, being deeply empathic, walking alongside, walking with people in their pain in such a way that the church is known for being a place of not only deep lament, but deep empathy and care, and being willing to change ourselves for the sake of the pain of our neighbors is a really important sign of a healthy church.
So I'm hearing you separate out this loss and lament from ambiguity, which you say is unhealthy. How would you keep those two separate?
Well, there's certain ambiguity, like I put it this way, there's certain uncertainty that you just don't want to fake. Like if I don't know an answer, my answer is to become humble and learn, right? If I don't have an answer, if I don't have a plan. So that's different. What loss is really about my going into and acknowledging, seeing the pain of my neighbor. And I still may not have a plan to solve it, but I'm going to walk in, care, be present until we discern what we should do that is faithful. The ambiguity that gives us problems is when we make half-hearted decisions that are about trying to keep everybody happy rather than clear convictions about what we are called to do missionally.
Doesn't the loss of familiar, which also creates this lament, or should, doesn't that also create some ambiguity, the loss of this?
Oh, uncertainty for sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I would say, one of the things is there is a whole psychological study that says that the 3 hardest words for humans to say is, "I don't know." And for most leaders today, this is the challenge. We were put into we think we're leaders because we were experts, right? So like in the same way that we thought leadership was about power, we think leadership is about expertise. So I always say, whoever is the best preacher gets made pastor. It's an interesting thing. You could be really good at speaking. Are you any good at leading? I don't know, right? Right. So every single person who comes to seminary, somebody said to them, "You're the best Christian I know. You should go pro. You should go off to professional Christian school." And we give them a master's of divinity, and they come home sounding like they're a superhero. And people expect them to be the expert. And in certain things they are. A lot of times they're the expert in their congregation about biblical interpretation or history or polity or pastoral care. Well, then when you have to lead people into a changing world, you actually have to stand in front of these people whom you love and whom trust you, and now say to them, "I don't know where the future's going. We're going to have to learn as we go. It's going to be hard. We're going to be really clear about what we're not going to change, but we're going to have to experiment with changing a lot of other stuff."
So I like how you're saying that we're not letting go of everything.
Oh, no.
There's a piece of who we are which will never change. So thinking about that, that really requires some legwork, though, some homework, though, right? To dig deep into the story of the church and uncover. What does that look like to really do the work necessary to uncover that original mission, the identity of the church that is healthy, that we can build on and renew?
Yeah, this is actually the core work that I do at the Church Leadership Institute and that we do in consulting. I speak and teach and write, but what we try to do is bring people, leadership teams, into cohorts where they actually work on this process. They develop the capacity to lead that process. And what people are always surprised is the beginning of a process of change actually starts by getting clear on your core DNA. Like what your, the phrase I really like that our Catholic brothers and sisters use is our charism. What is our gift? What is it that makes us unique? What is our unique gift to the body of Christ and to the world? And getting really clear. And I think every congregation has something that they can celebrate that is unique. There was a reason a group of people got together and said, we are going to have a church in this town. There was a reason why a group of people, raised money for a building or stayed together. Like there were these reasons. And then once you pay attention to that deep sense of that charism, you ask the question, how does our charism, how does our gift, our values apply to the pain of our neighbors? And then how's that going to require us to change to be more about our charism being about our neighbors than about our own comfort in our own selves? And that's the transformation process we take people through.
So once we have a sense of something good that needs renewed,
yeah,
we focus in on that. But there are these moments, as you describe in your book, about needing to pull away and then sometimes go deeper into the fire, to balance both of those things, to push for a season, and help people change. What's the phrase? As much as they can handle. What's that phrase? How's that?
Yeah, the Ronald Heifetz's famous phrase is leadership is disappointing people at a rate they can absorb.
That's it. So how do you find that rhythm of disappointing, pushing, but pulling back and celebrating?
Yeah, so the imagery of adaptive change that's often used is one of like a crock pot, right? So like a crock pot, if you have the right ingredients, good ingredients at the right temperature of heat at the right amount of time, it transforms. If it's too hot and it just scorches and burns, then people throw it out. It's bitter and they're not going to eat it. It's not going to feed anybody. But what most of us today, we're so afraid of burning it that what we think is transformation will happen by putting a crock pot at 1 degree above room temperature and hope that it'll magically transform. And what actually happens is that it spoils before it's transformed. It becomes toxic. And I think many of our churches have become toxic because we're not able to have enough heat to transform us. And that heat is actually healthy conflict, urgency about mission, restlessness, appropriate restlessness about God's call in our lives. And the way to think about it is the work of the leader is developing both the crock pot, which is the trust of relationships that holds. It's what Ronald Heifetz calls the holding environment, and then monitoring the heat. And I always tell pastors, you don't have your hand on the thermostat. You are the thermostat. Whatever you can handle in your own transformation, however long you can stay with these people through this work, whatever you can handle, they can go with you in it. It's not something you do to them. You're doing something you're doing with them. So it's building trust, a safety to be able to go through a transformation that is going to be uncomfortable at times.
Which I guess is why you're describing so poignantly in your book that the key work is often with us as pastors, becoming non-anxious presences, becoming that kind of leader who is okay with him or herself, right?
Yeah, Ed Friedman uses that phrase, non-anxious leader. I got to tell you, I think the only body non-anxious is dead. So I always say, I want to be the least anxious person in the room. And the part of the way I do that is by acknowledging my own anxiety. I mean, if I was the pastor you talked about whose board met without them and changed the rule, it would be everything. I would need every bit of maturity I can muster, not to want to like kick over chairs or run screaming away, but to stay calmly in the middle of a conversation where I try to understand why we undid the very decisions we made that thought it was best and why we did it the way we did. It's really a critical task and it's really hard.
So one last question here. We're about to end of 30 minutes.
Yeah.
In your epilogue, you graciously give pastors permission to move on if things aren't really working out. How would you help a minister assess whether they need to really get back in the fire.
Yeah.
And work some more, or whether this is not a forge, to use the metaphor of your book, this is not a forge worth investing in anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of that season, right, of assessing, right?
Yeah. So I would say it this way, which is one of the critical parts about adaptive change. It's about transformation. Like, just understand it's about transformation. And one of the key principles is you give the work back to the people that's most affected. So if you're leading a group of people and you keep giving the work back to them and saying, this is the work we're going to have to do together, and they don't want to do it, they just don't want to do it, I think there comes a moment where you start asking the Lord, do you want me to stay? I mean, I think it's always difficult, but I do think that it can't be about I'm the hero who's going to make it happen. You have to just acknowledge that there's going to be changes that don't happen, and that you might just be the voice that prophetically calls them to something that they're not going to be ready to do. It's like they're not ready to bear fruit yet. So if that happens, then I would say that you open yourself up to the idea that you'll go to someplace else and you'll start the process of being a transformative leader. And my hope is just this is what I live. My calling is to help faith leaders thrive as change leaders. And some of those folks just have to say that our congregations are not interested in changing. So I'm going to pray that God will take me to a group of people who want to do this work together, because it's not something you can do by yourself and out of your own strength.
So just to reassure us, there is no particular place in the country where these issues do not exist.
Really, I don't know if it does. If it was, I think we'd all be trying to find it. We're all in it. This is actually one of the parts that, Jason, that is so remarkable, is that, when Canoeing the Mountains came out in 2015, I had people say to me, some denominations, some people are in this, some people are not, some people are still in Christendom, it's okay. The pandemic put us all in the same place. So now the world is in a time of disruption. Every church is in a time of disruption, and at least every church in the West. I think there are some signs of vibrancy and hope in the global South and in other places of the world, because they weren't as disrupted as much as we have been, because they have been already living in this world of change. We've got churches that are not as dependent upon kind of cultural privilege and power as we are, and they don't have as many facilities and buildings and stuff. So I think that for us, almost all of us are facing the exact same thing. And what I've known from talking to people all over the theological spectrum, all over the denominational spectrum, is that the reality of trying to be faithful to the call that God has given us in the context we're in this rapidly changing world, means we're all facing the same kind of challenges for change.
Well, Tod Bolsinger, it's been an enormous pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing. And I pray that we have ears to hear and courage to walk in the ways in which you directed us through the Lord's Spirit. All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.